Okay, trying to script this made me discombobulated, so let me try this unscripted. This is an addendum to my Elden Ring review, addressing some things that I didn't address, or didn't address enough because I missed the forest for the trees, so to speak. The main thing I was thinking about is the boss fights. I feel I got too off in the weeds about the fairness of the bosses, without considering how many of them are actually good fights. Like, whether the boss in a vacuum is fair or not doesn't necessarily mean that the fight is fun. So for instance, take the Tree Sentinels. Most of the Tree Sentinels are found in tiny underground boxes, where they take up like a third of the room at once just by themselves. And they flail around. Most of their body ends up clipping through the walls so you can't see what they're doing. If you get up close to them, they fill your entire screen and you can't see what they're doing. In a vacuum, there's nothing unfair about the Tree Sentinel's moveset. But in the context that they're usually fought in, they're just irritating. Because their attacks seemingly come out of nowhere because you can't see what they're doing. And the arena's too small for a boss of that size. The best fights against the Tree Sentinels are out in the open. The Fire Giant, right? There's nothing unfair about the Fire Giant. But that doesn't mean I think he's good. Like, frankly, he's just kind of tedious, right? Most of his attacks just one-shot you. So what you end up doing is you end up going up behind him and stabbing his feet for however many minutes until his giant-ass health bar gets to 0. I would have preferred more of a brawl, you know? One where he's got more, like, dynamism to him. Right? Where if you try to get up behind him, he actually, like, turns around and tries to step on you or something. You know? Like a souped-up version of fighting one of the trolls. You know the trolls? I would have preferred if the Fire Giant was like a super version of fighting the trolls. But that's not what we got. The Dragonkin in the Lake of Rot. Fighting a boss in a rot lake without torrent is just cancer. It's irritating as fuck to try and deal with that. If you could just use torrent in the Lake of Rot, I wouldn't have a problem with it, right? Because then you had this sort of heightened tension of, just like in the Kaled Rot swamp, right? Where you can use torrent, so it's like, okay, if I avoid damage, I won't get knocked off of torrent, and then I won't have to deal with the Scarlet Rot. But since you can't use torrent in the Lake of Rot, for some reason, you gotta deal with the fucking Rot Lake while trying to fight this fucker. Again, it's the same thing as the Elden Beast fight. Why can't I use torrent? All the problems with the fight would be fixed if you just use torrent. The Sentinel Shade. No, sorry, not the Sentinel Shade. The Cemetery Shade. My boy, he's got like no health. He just dies in 5 seconds. Seems like it could be a cool enemy, but if I'm being honest, I don't even know what his moveset is, because I've always just killed him in 5 seconds, and that's it. Come on, you gotta buff him. He's like nothing. He's not even a fight. And they reuse him several times. And, you know, normally I don't have a problem with copy-pasted fights, but, like, fighting a single duelist several times with no changes, it's literally just the duelist swinging his weapons around on chains, is boring. Right? At least give each of them, like, a different gimmick. Add something to their moveset that makes them different from each other. That's lazy. I don't mind that a lot of the dragons are copy-pasted. I would prefer it if more of them had unique abilities, like Lanziacs and Fortisacs and such, rather than just being palette swaps. But I honestly don't mind it too much, because fighting dragons is just cool in general. But beyond that, I don't really think I have any problems with any of the other bosses. But I did want to mention that I do have problems with bosses beyond just Malenia and the Elden Beast. But beyond the list I just mentioned, I don't really Don't really have a problem with any of them. But stuff like the Tree Sentinel brings up a bigger problem. And I did mention this in my review, but I really want to focus on this because it's a real problem. It might be the biggest problem with the game's combat, frankly. Not the fact that some weapons are undertuned or overtuned, or that magic's too easy, or jump attacks are too easy, or whatever, or spirit ashes are too easy. It's the fact that this game does not have a dynamic animation system. Right? The reason that the Tree Sentinel constantly clips through the walls so you can't even see what it's doing is because every enemy in this game has like fixed animations for everything they do. They are unchanging. They do not take the environment or situation they find themselves in into account. So if an enemy has an attack and there's an obstacle in the way, the designers have two choices. They can either have the environment block the attack, or they can have the attack go right through it. Now, some attacks, usually ranged ones, are blocked, but melee attacks usually aren't. Melee attacks usually go right through solid objects. Best example is the fucking golems. Right? It doesn't matter how thick the walls are. It doesn't matter if you're standing at the bottom of a staircase. It doesn't matter if you're standing at the top of a staircase. It doesn't matter if you're standing on top of the Grand Lift's stone platform. His fucking halberd will go right through all of it and hit you. Like it's a fucking phantasmal blade. It's horse shit. It looks like horse shit. It feels like horse shit because the enemy literally can't modify its attacks based on where you are. Meanwhile, all of your attacks, of course, do get blocked by physical objects. So it's blatantly unfair. The enemies aren't playing by the rules. But at the same time, they kind of have to, because otherwise you could just cheese the shit out of them. I mean, it can't be that hard. We've had dynamic animation systems in games since what? Fucking Crysis? Right? Where they actually went through the trouble of having character walking animations and firing animations change on the fly depending on the terrain, so that the character's feet were always on the ground, rather than how it is with most games back then, which is it was just a set animation, and if the character was on uneven ground, their toes would just be sticking either into the ground or into the air. Like, this isn't new tech. So I don't understand why... And they intentionally made this an open world game, right? Where the opposition will be constantly facing the player in many different possible situations and environments. So why would you think that going with pre-baked animations that don't take into account the level geometry is a good idea? Like, honestly, I'm convinced that that is part of the reason why most boss fights take place in completely open arenas with no cover, no interesting vantage points or like level design at all, right? Like it's not even like a Doom like battle arena. You've got like higher and lower areas and paths and shit you can take. Like it's literally just a flat open arena, because if there were anything there, it would be blatantly obvious all the time that the boss's AI and animations can't handle it. But the open world sabotages that because it makes it blatantly obvious anyway. They need to fix this. I don't care if it like sacrifices the whole, oh, you're supposed to memorize the boss's attack patterns. I don't give a shit. It's better that the bosses have unpredictable attacks than that they be able to hit you through fucking walls. If me and the enemy are both in a tunnel, the enemy shouldn't be able to take a giant fucking halberd and swing it through one wall, through the tunnel, and through the other wall. Alright? He should have to either do a poking attack or a slash attack. Top down. To avoid the walls. Alright? There should be a system by which those attack animations can change to fit the level geometry. That needs to change. And just as a counterbalance to this, since I have talked about bosses I have problems with, and this general animation problem, I do want to point out there are more bosses I like than just Placidusax. Off the top of my head, I really like the Godskin Apostle. I love the little dance you have to play with him, right? Trying to fight the one Dragon Barrow after doing Caelid, even though it's an endgame area. Very challenging, also very fun. I like doing that. They're copy-pasted, but honestly, I like the Knight's Cavalry, right? Doing, like, horseback, whirling, circling duels with the Knight's Cavalry is great shit. Honestly, I wish there were more enemies in the game that were mounted. There's a distinct lack of cavalry in the game for some reason. I wish there were more of them, because, horseback fights with the Knight's Cavalry are some of the best fights in the game, in my opinion. Like I said, I like the dragons. I especially like, aside from Placidusax, Fortisax and Lanziax are also great fights. I love the idea of the Mimic tier fight. I wish it used summons, because without summons it's just hopeless, because obviously since it's a copy of the player, it has far less health than most other bosses. So I feel it needs to use summons in order to balance the fight out. Or even maybe, instead of giving it flasks, you could simply take your current flask total and just give it one giant health bar equal to that flask total, the amount of health that those flasks would heal, instead of the flasks themselves, to make it more like a traditional boss fight. I think it's a good idea, it just wasn't perfectly executed. And honestly, I really like Malekith, because since Malenia ends up being bullshit, in my opinion, Malekith ends up being sort of the hard skill check boss. Right? The one that really tests your reaction times and ability to dodge your counterattacks and identify openings to attack him. Because he's so acrobatic, right? That the opportunities don't seem immediately obvious. A lot of people seem to hate that, but I quite like it, even though I struggled a lot with it because, like I said, my reaction time is garbage. Before I get into the other main thing I wanted to talk about, one thing I forgot to mention when I was praising the game world is the underground portion. Not only is the reveal from like an aesthetic perspective when you're going down the Siofra elevator brilliant, but the variety of locations, the way that they're not only physically connected but aesthetically revealed to you, is just amazing. The Nokron to Moonlight Altar dungeon crawl, right? Like after you fight Radahn, which is already one of the best fights in the game, it's so epic. You and your buds taking on the Star Scourge, right? So you already have that awesome fight, and then immediately after that, you get to go to Nokron, which you've already seen from below, because you've been to Siofra River, but seeing it from above is spectacular, alright? Walking along the fucking aqueduct is one of the most visually stunning things in the entire game. You do Nokron, you have the Mimic tier, you have the Silver tier enemies, you find a bunch of cool stuff, and then if you're observant enough, you notice the little path that leads onto the Siofra Aqueduct, which then leads you to the Gargoyle fight, which then leads you to the Coffin that takes you down to the Deeproot Depths, which is a completely different area, even though it's another Eternal City, but it's at the base of the Erd Tree. Bunch of cool lore stuff goes on down there, right? That's where Fia's questline goes. That's where Godwyn is. It's where you fight Fortisax. And then it still doesn't stop. It keeps going. And then you go down from there, and you end up in the Ainsel River, which is more claustrophobic, until it opens up into Noxtella. And then you go through Noxtella, and you keep going down, and you end up in the Lake of Rot, which, again, you probably already saw a glimpse of, but actually being there is even more spectacular. And you finally end up fighting Estelle, which is a completely unique enemy, except for its copy-paste in the snowfield. Which leads you to the Moonlight Altar, which is also visually stunning, if a little more generic, because it is part of Liurnia. which is where Ronnie's questline takes you if you want to do that. As a dungeon crawl, it is huge. It's also extremely varied visually, aesthetically, for being a dungeon crawl. It's one of the greatest dungeon crawls I've ever played in anything ever. It's astounding. It's probably the best part of the entire game. I say that as someone who really loves Lane Dell, but I don't think any of the above ground dungeons have anything on that Nokron to Moonlight Altar path. It's so epic. It really feels like a high fantasy adventure. It's amazing. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about. This is kind of a more general topic than just Elden Ring, but I'm going to use Elden Ring to talk about this because it's very relevant. I didn't mean to imply in my review that all the weapons and abilities and items you get in Elden Ring are all balanced. That all playstyles are equal in terms of game balance or difficulty or anything. Or that even all of them are useful. Like, that's blatantly not the case, right? I cannot tell you how disappointed I was when I found the Elden Stars incantation, then tried it and realized it was completely useless garbage. I'm not defending that. What I'm saying is, the variety is important aesthetically. It's important from a player power fantasy perspective. Because, I mean, even if we cut out the difference in items, right? Like, let's say you have two player characters. One, and they're both using Rivers of Blood, right? They both kill Ashina and take Rivers of Blood from him. One is still wearing the samurai armor he got as a starting class. He's been wearing it since the beginning of the game. And the other is like a barbarian character who's like using it because of the bleed buildup and because it's cursed and it slashes and cuts apart his enemies. And that sort of fits the barbarian wrath kind of thing he's going for. Now, mechanically, they're using the same weapon. So, mechanically, both of these characters end up playing the same. But aesthetically, the bloodthirsty barbarian character and the samurai character come off, in terms of the kind of player power fantasy they're playing into, completely differently, purely because of the character's aesthetic, right? One is a bloodthirsty killer who's using Rivers of Blood because it makes his enemies bleed even harder. And the other is a foreigner in a far-off land who's really stuck to mementos of his homeland. Because Rivers of Blood is a katana. Mechanically the same, but aesthetically completely different, and therefore they appeal to completely different player power fantasies, despite functioning the same. And this is important. Elden Ring is an action RPG. For the most part, you don't define your character by what you do, because there's very few quests, and very few of them have any real consequence except for the ones that give you an ending choice. What defines your character, really, is how they fight, right? What power fantasy do they embody? Because it's always much easier to make visual variety than meaningful mechanical variety, having a plethora of different outfits to wear, weapons to wield, spells to use, items to throw, even if many of them are like kind of similar or crossover-ish or seemingly irrelevant, is important, because even if they might be pointless mechanically, aesthetically, they are important because they can feed into completely different power fantasies for the player to get invested in. Like, I don't remember off the top of my head how many straight swords there are in the game, but you could argue, we don't really need all of these, do we? Like, they're kind of the same thing, but the human imagination is brilliant. You can conceivably construct a power fantasy around using any one of them based on a different aesthetic you have for that particular character that one or the other fits into better based purely on how it looks or how it would hypothetically function differently if it were real, even though it's not real. That's why the variety is so important. You know, it's funny. I actually had a section at the end here where I said, I'm sure if I think of anything else, I'll make another addendum. But I don't have to do that, because I thought of it before I put this out. You gotta adopt scroll wheels. Alright? You've gotta adopt selection wheels like everyone else, okay? Having all these spell and item slots is a pain in the ass because you have to cycle through them with up and down on the D-pad. It's a pain in the ass. And unless you're playing Claw, which is uncomfortable as shit, you gotta take your thumb off the left stick, which means you can't move while you're doing it. So all the items and all the spells that you can get, you're disincentivized from actually using almost any of them, because if you have a bunch of them equipped at once, it's really awkward to flip between them. So you end up being incentivized to have as few as possible equipped, so you can select them rapidly. You've got to switch to selection wheels. Holding up on the D-pad should show a spell wheel. Down, item wheel. Left, weapon wheel. Right, weapon wheel. Current system's too clunky for how many items you can equip. It's good that you can equip so many items at once and have like a large set of tools to work with at any given time, but the controls just don't work for it. Anyway, that's it. Now, if I think of anything else, I'll make another addendum.